Coming up, a trio of New York football giants appeared over the weekend at MetLife Stadium. Are any of them going to be a part of this team's future? And also, what can we learn from contracts and how Joe Schoen approaches this offseason to tell us if the outlook should be bright or dim coming into 2024? We dive in next. Yes, my friends. It is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. Over there, Andrew Makowitz. He's healthy, he's wealthy, he's wise, and he's coming off a weekend where the NHL had they do obviously the outdoor series every single year. You had the Devils, you had the Rangers getting wins, and then you had a couple of Giants show up there who, I don't know, I guess set social media at least a little bit ablaze, Andy, with the speculation of what does it mean to see Saquon Barkley in his jersey at MetLife Stadium in the offseason? Take it away.
Well, the funny part is that's the first speculation that comes out because obviously Saquon Barkley was there holding and announcing some of the team. It was all the pageantry at MetLife that they put together. But also, Saquon Barkley was there with both Tommy DeVito and Sterling Shepard. So when you think about reading between the tea leaves, Tommy DeVito is the only one that's technically under contract moving forward if the Giants want him to be. But
Right.
there are question marks about all three players, potentially any of them being back. So do you find it weird that people are getting so bent out of shape over this? Or do you find it more weird that the Giants would bring out three guys that may not even be part of this roster next season?
Yeah, I mean, who knows? Because there's certainly a number of players you can pick from. Like if I took a step back and I said, why not Bobby Okereke, right? Why not Kayvon Thibodeau? Why not, I was gonna say about to say Xavier McKinney, let that slip out there. Yeah, why not even you look at offensive linemen? Why not Andrew Thomas, right? Why not any of these players? Micah McFadden, go with some young guys, go with some rookies. Why not Deontay Banks? There's all these players that it wouldn't even be a thing. It would just be, oh, we saw some Giants players at the games and that was nice. On the one hand, I always trend on the side of this, and Andy, I don't care because I don't think this means anything. I think that you put in the PR request and you want the big names, and as far as the Rangers or the NHL is concerned, they're like, yeah, we want Saquon Barkley. The Giants say, honestly, guys, we're in a bit of a hotbed right now with him. I don't even know if he can be part of the team in 2024. And they go, guess what, guys? We don't give a crap. We couldn't care any less about whether or not this guy's going to be on your team. Sterling Shepard, do you want to say that that's a nice moment for him by the organization to put him up there? Sure. Same thing for Tommy DeVito. I don't know. I'm sure I should want to read between these lines, but I cannot go that far. Including people in the media are speculating oh, well, this is clearly an indication that they want to have him back. Maybe it is. Maybe I'm on the on the dim side of this ledger going forward. And we've heard some numbers get thrown out now again about what a contract could potentially look like in terms of offers. But I never connect these dots the way that I think people want me to.
Well, if you connect that dot, are you saying that the Giants want Sterling Shepard back then? Because he was
Exactly.
standing right next to him with a jersey, right?
Right.
So I think people sometimes read into it a little bit too much. I mean, think about it. Sterling Shepard could potentially retire, spend his whole career as a Giant. If he does end up going out and retiring as a Giant, what a perfect send off. He's doing his tour for all New Yorkers, New Jerseyans. That's great. Tommy DeVito was the talk of the town for 3 weeks of the entire NFL.
That's
Why
right.
would the Giants not capitalize it? I mean, the hockey players came out in soprano jumpsuits and they did the Tommy DeVito celebration after scoring goals. That to
Right.
me makes total sense. Just capitalize on the notoriety and noteworthiness because we never know when the 15 minutes of fame ends. Yes, Saquon Barkley is still the face of the Giants. I believe that the contract ends at the start of the new league year. So
23 days
technically
away.
he's still running around. And if you believe Saquon Barkley when he says, I want to be a Giant for life, then when they ask for these requests, he says yes, and he goes and does these things.
Right.
I'm actually more in agreement with you where it doesn't really matter. Sterling Shepard's the longest tenured Giant. Saquon Barkley's the face, and Tommy DeVito is the most popular person over the last 6 months. It actually makes sense the people that they picked, contract or otherwise.
And by the way, too, actually, the one footnote that I would make, if I wanted to connect any dots here from a Saquon Barkley perspective, because to your point, hey, we want to reach out to players. Go ahead. You get three. I mean, the Giants get final approval, but, the Rangers say we'd love to have Saquon Barkley there. We'd love to have Sterling Shepard, Tommy DeVito, whatever. And maybe they said, you name your third, and they said Sterling Shepard. But if it's Saquon Barkley, he's like, love to. Would love to be there. I'd love to put on my Giants jersey, show up at the stadium, be really into it, be in the environment. Because again, like I am, whether or not I ultimately do want to be a Giant, I am also in a PR, narrative here where I get to say, see, I love being a part of it. I love being a part of the community. I love showing up for hockey games, supporting other teams, right? So from his side of it, I can understand. Like if he gets it put on his table, there's no world where Saquon Barkley's like, oh, I'm kind of in this, difficult off season right now with the organization. It's probably best if I don't make too many public appearances. No, like he's like, dude, look at me in my jersey. Don't I look so good in my Giants jersey? The thing you don't want to see me not wear in 2024. So I will give like the Saquon Barkley camp credit if he has his choice on these types of things.
Don't you feel like it would have been a bigger deal if it came out that they wanted Saquon Barkley there and he was like, absolutely not until I get
It
a
couldn't
contract?
possibly.
Like then all of a sudden the PR machine turns the other way and they're like, what is Saquon Barkley doing? He doesn't appreciate being a Giant and being a face of the franchise. So
Right.
like to me, it just seems like that was probably the path of least resistance. And it's also showing that he's saying, I do want to be a Giant. Just pay me fairly and I will be. It still remains to be seen what that contract is going to actually look like.
Okay, so let's turn our attention to another topic here for the New York Football Giants, and it's something that a fan pointed out on YouTube, or at least they asked the question was, last week we were discussing the amount of money they have and how they could spend it, and we talked about free agents to target, and he said, like, am I seeing something wrong here? Because it doesn't look like they have that much cap space, and it's true, and we already highlighted like Lewinsky's a big decision. We debated if Darren Waller could be a straight up cut candidate or outright release him. Some fans said, hey, why not trade him for a third or fourth round? I said, well, if you want to talk fifth round, we can have a discussion. But, ultimately moving off of that money. But here's what I think is important to look at. If you go over, and right now it's actually at 19.46 million if you go over the cap. But there's always this one mechanism that impacts teams across the board. So Patrick Mahomes did this a couple of years ago and freed up like an extra 5 or 6 million, maybe coming to this last year, to make sure that the Chiefs can make a couple of marginal moves. The contracts are structured. We talk about like restructuring deals. It basically is a catch-all for teams can try to redo them any way that they want. If it starts to move anything other than signing bonuses, roster bonuses, then it gets into a little more murkier water where usually the player gets brought in to have that discussion, unless we're talking about, as you highlighted last week, Glowinski saying, hey man, either we're redoing this deal or you can go ahead and kick rocks, right? So I went in and looked at it though. There's a couple of interesting notes here when we talk about 23 million for Andrew Thomas. Well, if I say let's restructure that, then that essentially means prorating out bonuses over the life of his contract and freeing up short-term money. You could turn around and all of a sudden take yourself from 19 million to $35 million in cap space this offseason, if you so chose. So point stop. Before we even talk about some other guys they could do it with, do you believe that if you see a move like that from Joe Schoen, that it tells you what this team thinks they're capable of in this year? Because otherwise, in my opinion, it's why jump to make these types of moves before you absolutely need to. The following offseason, they're going to have upwards of $90+ million in cap space.
Yeah, Adam, it's a very interesting question that you pose. Another little wrinkle is that you can also add void years onto contracts, which is just adding additional years where cap space gets kick the can down the line.
And that's a
With this
little bit
kind of move.
trickier with like how it impacts your money and stuff. Like the most Joe Shane Giants friendly way is like, if we could restructure this thing, all it means is we shuffle money around, not maybe end up having, negative impact year over year. But go ahead.
Yeah, and you mentioned before I get into the specifics of your
Yeah.
question, you mentioned a little bit about like, yeah, these are all procedural. Usually the player is on board and the agent will just be like, hey, we're restructuring it. Basically, it just means you get paid a little bit more upfront. Like nothing else changes for you. And they're like, great, sounds good. I'll take that. There are other times where, players look at it and say, I don't want to do anything because I'm in a position of strength. The Giants need cap space. I want an extra bonus. I want an incentive. I want a new deal. And so then all of a sudden it takes two to tango in terms of being able to get the right structure.
Yep.
Usually it's procedural, as you mentioned, but sometimes if the player wants something more than just their money up front, it can get a little hairy. I
Yeah.
do believe that it is going to be interesting to see what Joe Schoen does and if he does decide to restructure any of the contracts. You mentioned someone like Andrew Thomas. You could obviously restructure Dexter Lawrence after he
Yep.
had his big deal and moved money. You generally like to restructure deals on players that you know are going to be here as part of the long-term solution, so that you're not sitting with dead money or a big number later on and you're banging your head against the wall like, why did I do that? And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people say, whatever you do, you cannot touch the Daniel Jones contract this season.
Mm-hmm.
You have to absorb his cap hit and his cap number this year, because if you restructure it, you're pushing his money further down the line and saying, essentially, we need that money now to either compete, function, or do whatever. I do think your point is how we decide to do this with players like Andrew Thomas and Dexter Lawrence, less indicative to me than how it goes with a guy like Daniel Jones, who has so many question marks beyond this season, whether or not he's going to be on the roster.
Yeah, of course. And we'll get into his contract as well here. And at that question that maybe is a little bit, juicier than Giants fans may want to perceive it to be. One note is, so the way that over on Pro Football Network as well, when they break down talking about restructures, a simple restructure is what we've been discussing, converting payments into signing bonuses, prorating them over the life of the contract. It's known as simple because it doesn't really require much of a lift. You mentioned about maximum restructure. A maximum restructure, a club will either extend a player's contract, tack on void years, like you said, at the end of the deal, but void years are essentially dummy seasons that exist only for the reason to prorate the signing bonus out over the long term. They can do simple restructures without asking a player, but maximum restructures are usually, hey, player is on board. So when you talk about an Andrew Thomas, when you talk about Dexter Lawrence, like, of course I'm on board. I'm here for the long haul. So if you want to move the money around, I do find it interesting. Like with Dexter Lawrence, they seem to get on the front foot of his contract. And we all kind of, when those numbers came out, we said, like not, I thought that could have been a little bit steeper. Now, when you go in and look and we see that he's making 22 million, you go, oh, it's not no money, but it is interesting to think about how they view him over the life of his contract and then beyond it as well. So here's one note before we get into, because as you can see, if you're watching over on YouTube, and please, by all means, go subscribe and like the podcast over there as well if you're listening from the audio standpoint. The last thing we have here is offseason impact, and I'm going to save that for Daniel Jones, because last week we also talked about Darren Waller, and this is where it was interesting, because if I said restructure Darren Waller's contract, which is something that I think is interesting given that he's 32 years old, we understand some of the injury history, but you can bounce from 19 up to that $26.28 million cap range. And I think this kind of goes in the face of what we discussed last time of, well, would the Giants just cut him and eat the dead cap? Nope. This becomes the more viable option here. If I'm Joe Schoen, hey, Darren Waller, we love you, baby. Let's talk about adding some void years on the back end of this thing so that we can make the team around you and around Daniel Jones better. And then you avoid the dead cap number. Now, will Darren Waller sign off on that? We don't know. But I found it really interesting that basically that's $7-something million in cap relief. It's the same exact thing, whether they go ahead and restructure versus outright cutting him, releasing him, or even trading him and having to eat some money as well, which I think is really noteworthy for this offseason.
Yeah, that is with Darren Waller. There's a whole host of ways that Joe Schoen can approach it. As I mentioned on the last podcast where we talked about the situation with Waller, the fact that Joe Schoen gave up what he did to acquire Darren Waller, I just feel like an outright cut would be an admission that he made a mistake in acquiring Darren Waller, and it would
who cares?
No. Well, that's the thing. It would look bad on Joe Schoen, but then also, would you give Joe Schoen credit for not throwing bad money at a bad contract or a bad situation? So, like, it's a little bit of both, where you can say it was a bad move, but you're doing the right thing now to correct it. That's one way of looking at it. The second is he's already made the investment. Darren Waller, when healthy, is a tremendous talent. We do not have the offensive weapons to just be letting guys like Darren Waller go. It's a very intricate balance of, if he's healthy, he's electric, but he's often injured and he's expensive. But we need weapons on offense, especially if Saquon Barkley is going to walk out the door. That to me is the really difficult part. Adam, imagine this: they cut Darren Waller, Saquon Barkley's gone, and you look at this offense with Daniel Jones coming off a torn knee and a host of neck injuries, and you say, where's the explosiveness? How are we going to get to 20 points a game given the current setup? And we don't necessarily have the cap space to go out and pay a T. Higgins $20-something million. We don't have the money to be able to do these things. Never mind re-signing someone like Xavier McKinney. To me, it almost feels like you'd be really thinking about how low can you go next season in order to come out the following season in even better shape.
Did Sterling Shepard resign in this scenario? Because I mean that impacts, you know, I mean, yeah, you lose Saquon Barkley, you lose Darren Waller, a little bit of explosive, but you bring back the old Shepard, you know, and all of a sudden we're going to be okay. No, to your point, like it's difficult, right? And these things matter, but the other way that you can look at this too is, and that's what I want to get into, which will probably be the lengthiest portion of this discussion, the Daniel Jones piece. You can also think about it as, again, right, wrong, indifferent. You believe he's going to come back healthy, et cetera, et cetera. Or you can think about Xavier McKinney and you can think about Saquon Barkley and you want to get those guys in the door. So if we tie this whole thing underneath the umbrella of everything the Giants want to accomplish, maybe they want to add Bryce Huff from the Jets. Maybe they want to add Robert Hunt from the Dolphins. Maybe they also want to keep Saquon Barkley and Xavier McKinney. When you go over right now as well, you can find the potential for restructure value across every single organization. The Giants, through simple restructure, so ones that aren't really that big of a deal from a player side, from a player perspective, the Giants can free up, they can get to $67 million in cap relief by just restructuring contracts, that currently exist on their roster. One among them, by the way, too, would be a guy by the name of Graham Gano, who can save them a nice little chunk of change as well if they go ahead and move his money around a little bit too. Something that's like interesting. It's you know, marginal, a few $1,000,000, but for an old kicker that maybe you'd like to be able to just get rid of completely, guess what? Dead money, even on an aging veteran kicker. It brings me to this though. Daniel Jones. So all these conversations, everything that we have going on here with the New York Football Giants, if you look at Daniel Jones' contract and you say, let's restructure that money, and I want to make sure that I take off the Darren Waller, I'm going to take off the Graham Gano because I'm doing it in real time, $19.4 million in cap room. Let's restructure Daniel Jones' contract. By doing that, the Giants have $42.7 million in cap space this offseason immediately. So, you know, we've long talked about what the future should be and how they should approach it, and knowing you can walk away clean from the contract after this season with Daniel Jones. But if this organization believes in Daniel Jones, if Joe Schoen believes in Daniel Jones, Mike Kafka, Brian Dable, if these guys believe in him, then there is the world where if you go down this path right here, you're bringing back Saquon Barkley, you're bringing back Xavier McKinney, and you're able to do all the things that you want to do this offseason. And then you can even go further by looking at Dexter Lawrence, Andrew Thomas, and really ramping up. Do you think the Giants believe not only Daniel Jones, but this team this year, where making that kind of move would actually make sense?
It's interesting because Joe Schoen
Yes, it is.
has shown that he does not want to do situations like that with other players. He could have restructured a few different players in his time, decided to just absorb what it is up front and say, we can work with this to get better cap health later on.
Yeah.
The Daniel Jones piece is interesting because on one end, it frees up a ton of cap space for them to operate next season.
Right.
On the other hand, it on the other hand, while Joe Schoen doesn't like doing this, he can point to exactly what you said and say, this is our admission that we believe Daniel Jones is still part of the longer term solution. He can almost have it both ways, where like he's borrowing from next year, which is really, really bad, but he's also showing a sign of faith potentially in Daniel Jones. So I don't think he's going to do it. I think most fans don't want him to restructure Daniel Jones,
Sure.
but also as a fan, you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you want this team to be competitive this upcoming season, if you want them to have the best chance to succeed this upcoming season, then you need that cap space for Daniel Jones. So it is funny to think about, like when people say don't restructure Daniel Jones, it's like, okay, well, tie Joe Schoen's hand behind his back in a year where if they don't do well, Brian Dable and Joe Schoen may not even be here to see the fruits of having all of those cost savings, right?
And this is the classic, you know, leaving a mess for someone else to clean up. Right now, let's walk through the Daniel Jones one here too, just to kind of crystallize what it means and what it would look like. So right now, Daniel Jones, let's just assume that he is here for the life of the contract, right? So he's making $47 million this year. He's on the books for 41.6 next year, and in 2026, he's on the books for 58.6 million. Okay, now back it up and let's say restructure that bad boy, right? Now, two things. They have 95.2 million in cap space projected for next season and 132 the year after. As soon as you say restructure, next year's offseason without any other moves drops by 12 million by making this restructure down to 83. And you know there's going to be other contracts, etc. Now, this year's hit would go down to 23.8 for Daniel Jones. The following year would be 53 million. And that final year of his contract, Andy, ballpark, what do you think Daniel Jones is making in 2026 of that contract?
In terms of just his overall salary or his cap
Cap
hit, what
number,
do you
overall cap number.
on the last year of his deal, I'm going to say 55 million.
You wish, baby. $70 million based on this
In terms of the
basic,
restructure, is that what you're
in
saying?
terms of the restructure. By taking the money away from here, you slide it down the line into another cap year. Now, there's other mechanics inside of these things, right? That 70 million wouldn't sit there full as a cap hit, because right now, when you look at it over the cap, it's going to tell you that he's getting a, let's take a look here, $70 million cap hit, 46.5 base salary, prorated bonus of 22.7, and then non-prorated bonus of $1 million. So what happens with that prorated money? Do you extend that out even beyond the life of his contract? How does all that end up happening here? But that's the problem, because you can't push to take away $13 million this year, or even more than that, 20 plus $million this offseason. It has to go somewhere. So it's 70 million that year. And you could say, okay, maybe we want to spread it out a little bit more evenly. It doesn't matter. You'd probably actually, if you're going to go this route, be talking about not only restructure, it'd be restructure with extension. Because now the prorated money gets spread out over another 3-4 years. That's actually the problem with a move like this for the Giants, if they wanted to do it, is that Daniel Jones only has 2 years left. When you go and look at, let's use the other example here. I don't know if people love getting in the weeds on the numbers, but I really do. When you talk about a guy like Andrew Thomas, now he's sitting here making let's do the total, $23.6 million this year, $20.9 million next year, $20.4 million the year after that, right? So he's only here through 2026. Again, hit the restructure button on his. Yes, it frees you up money now. But when you get to 2026 with him, his cap number only sits there at $24.3 million. The year prior, $24.8 million. Why? Because the bonuses and the conversions just aren't as sizable as the Daniel Jones contract. So you can make those moves with Dexter Lawrence, with an Andrew Thomas, and still keep it in the framework of this contract. Daniel Jones, it's going to be, yeah, let's prorate it. And then next offseason, let's extend you 3 years and then spread that money out. And let's keep walking down what could be a disastrous road for the Giants.
So just a little bit of level setting for everyone too on the Daniel Jones contract, just so that you understand where
Please
we
do.
are right now, Adam. In 2024, Daniel Jones will have a cap hit of $47 million. That is what it is going to be. If the Giants were to release him, his dead cap hit goes up $22 million. He would count $69 million against the cap. So
sure.
By keeping him on the roster, you are effectively lowering the cap hit for this. It's the one reason why, if you thought releasing Daniel Jones was on the table, it is most certainly not on the table, right? Like, I think we can all agree that there would have to be an alternate universe for the Giants to release Daniel Jones before this upcoming season, knowing how big his cap hit is if he's not on the roster as opposed to being on the roster.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I think is fascinating is we've talked about how this contract has been structured for Daniel Jones, that Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll can get out of this contract after 2 years, right? It's only really a 2-year commitment. And I think people are going to have a little bit of surprise or sticker shock that after this season, let's say they don't restructure Daniel Jones and he plays on that $47 million cap hit. Adam, when we talk about being able to get out of the contract, it's not that there's no guaranteed money after this upcoming season on the contract. It's just the numbers mean that you can free up cap space by releasing Daniel Jones. And the simple answer is he will count for $41 million against the cap, but the Giants can free up about $19 million-ish by releasing him. But by not having him on the roster, you still have a cap hit against him for $22 million. So if you don't restructure anything, he plays at $47 million this year. And if you release him after a year or two of this big contract, he still counts as $22 million against dead cap. People are going to freak out when they actually understand that number, because they're like, I thought we could get out of this after 2 years. Why are we paying Daniel Jones $22 million? And that's going to be a factor, depending on how he plays, when he plays this upcoming season, on whether or not he's here for year 3, because I think a lot of people are already assuming we're getting out of this contract immediately at the end of the season.
And not for nothing on that note too, because it is worthwhile. That 22 dead cap in what would be 2025, right? Coming out of that season. And then you end up with 19, as you mentioned, 0.3 million in cap relief. The following year, if you get rid of him in 2026, after 3 years of the contract, it's $11.1 million in dead cap and $47.5 million in cap relief. Like, that's the juicy year, right? After 3 years, then you go ahead and you look at it and you say, okay, if it wasn't working out, like, you can, if you're Joe Schoen, any GM, you can look at those numbers and go, oh, this math adds up. Like, I can take the net $36 million here in value in terms of dead money and cap relief and say, yep, we can go another direction. We can continue to resign guys. So it's a really good point to bring up here. While there is the out, it's not a clean out. It's an out with a couple of strings attached. And the one other thing, actually, let's end on a bit of a humorous note. Mike Tannenbaum, I'm sure people are aware of him. He was a former New York Jets GM. He came out at the end of last week and said, listen, there's options out there. Maybe the New York Football Giants should call the Cleveland Browns and trade Daniel Jones for Deshaun Watson. And I think in this process, the Browns also get a pick from the Giants, a second-round pick as well to go along with it. But here's a funny little thing about that story too, and it just goes into the Daniel Jones contract. Okay, so let's sit here and say you're not going to cut him. We know that. But let's say you say, all right, we're going to trade him. All right, let's trade him. Let's trade him ahead of what would be 6-1 this offseason. Well, guess what? It's still going to cost you when you make that decision. That same number Andy mentioned before after this year, 22.2 in dead and then 19 north in cap relief. If you do it post June 1, January, February, yeah, then you're talking about $11 million cap hit, 11 in dead, and 30.5 million in cap relief. Is there any world for you? Let's not say it's Deshaun Watson, because that has multiple years on it, and the guy hasn't looked very good. And he also, from what I can tell, not a great dude. Is there any scenario where you would, post June 1, open your mind up to trading for veteran quarterback X that you feel like in this moment right now makes this team better than Daniel Jones can, even if he's 100% healthy, when you see the numbers? Okay, 11 and dead, and all the relief you get probably swings right over to pay for that new quarterback coming in. And let's say the assets are relatively neutral, not a big swing in terms of draft capital.
I'm out on that completely. Like, to me,
you
that
wouldn't trade for Patrick Mahomes. I'm surprised by that. I'm surprised by you, Andy. I would do it. I would trade for Patrick Mahomes. That's me.
Listen, I want struggling Daniel Jones coming off an ACL injury over like the best quarterback that arguably that we've seen in quite some time.
Different strokes, right?
I want to talk about the Deshaun Watson piece really quickly, because I find it fascinating. Like, Mike Tannenbaum, it feels like he never was the general manager in New York. Like, the Mara and the Tisch family as owners, they have to a fault valued high character players and have shunned away players that have had problems over the last few years, because that's the image that the Giants have. We are character built. We are character driven. And you're telling me they would trade for a guy with questionable character in Deshaun Watson for, and ship off Daniel Jones, who seems to have the highest character it's actually what the Maras and Tishes look for. The other piece of it that I find fascinating is Daniel Jones's career quarterback rating is 85.2, right? You're like, okay, that's middle of the road. Deshaun Watson hasn't had an 85.2 quarterback rating since the 2020 season, when he had a great season and had 112. He was then out of the league for a year for a whole host of things. And then he came back, got traded to Cleveland, and has had 2 terrible seasons. So if you're looking to move off of the Daniel Jones contract, you're accepting a contract for a guy that you don't know if he's ever going to get back to where he was, with character issues off the field, with guaranteed money. You're giving up an additional second-round pick, and he hasn't played as well as Daniel Jones has in the last 4 seasons. Like, please explain to me how that would even make sense in anyone's mind. Someone needs to get their drunk uncle off of ESPN and Mike Tannenbaum. He's had too much to drink at the bar mitzvah. He needs to go home.
Honestly, Andy, how you can't wrap your head around getting an older, injured, more expensive, and probably less productive quarterback on your roster. I can't break this down any cleaner for you,
and
buddy.
give up more draft capital too.
Yes, and also with a slew of issues away from the game of football. Listen, it was we end on a light note here, right? Because, hey, while you may not always think that Joe Schoen has made the best decisions for the Giants over his first 2 years, and he's entering a critical third offseason for him and the Giants organization, at least it's not Mike Tannenbaum. I'll tell you that right now. You could always do worse. Listen, guys, you get over to YouTube because all this week we're going to continue this discussion. What would it mean to maybe go through some of these restructures in pursuit of improving key positions across this roster, and all the latest news on YouTube at One Giant Podcast, on Twitter at One Giant Podcast, at AndyMac214, and at Adam Armbrecht. Be sure to check out all of our sponsors in the show notes as well. We kept this one very clean, but it doesn't mean there isn't things we want you to go look at. And in the meantime, until next time, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.